Hello, my name's Colleen Getty, and I'm with The Room to Write, and today we're filming the Journey of a Story series, and we are talking to author Lisa Varchol Perron, and she's a poet. She has 2 picture books out with a 3rd one coming down the galley, Patterns Everywhere, and My Love for You, and welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So I'm going to ask you to do what I ask every author, because there's so many different ways people write, and we just sort of like to get an image of real writers writing. So what's your process when you sit down to write or stand and write? Are you on the computer, pencil, moving car? What's that look like for you?
So it looks different ways, different days, but very often I am at my dining room table, which has become my makeshift desk office. And so I work as a psychotherapist also. Now I'm doing all virtual. So I split my time more or less between writing and that. So when I sit down to write, I'm generally not having an entire day to do it. I like it when I do have longer chunks of time, but I write in those little spaces when I can. And so usually with my computer at the dining room table, but I take my laptop in the car if I'm dropping the kids off places, and if I'm going to be sitting and waiting in the car, I sometimes get things done that way. I sometimes have a notebook with me. I have one here a friend gave to me that has a special sort of creative feel to it. So I also like to have pen and paper with me if I get an idea. With poetry especially, sometimes I'll have a line that just hits me. And so I want to be able to either write it down on paper or write it down on my phone so I don't lose that line.
Right.
And then I can come back to it and flesh it out and turn it into something more.
Yeah. And so my heart belongs to poetry personally. So I'm going to make sure we talk a lot about poetry. And I think it's really interesting that you have a stack of things there that I'm going to let you talk a little bit about. But poetry, people think of not only do people have a hard time picture writers writing and thinking it's like this very mesmerizing process that happens in, behind closed doors, which it does often. But poetry, I feel like, is even more intimidating to people. And I just would love for you to talk a little bit about how poetry has sort of just spawned these things here, not only that stack and these books, but I also know you write longer form, which I know you haven't published yet, but like having read some of that, your poetry, everything you write is poetry, I think. So maybe talk about poetry in a way that's accessible to regular people.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I've loved poetry since I was a kid. We always would read Shel Silverstein together with my parents in evenings, and I loved Emily Dickinson at a young age and Robert Frost. So it's always been something that I've been very drawn to. And I think some of it is just loving language and just the delight of the sounds that come together and the imagery. I'm not someone who has ever been great at or interested in drawing or that form of art. So I think creating pictures with words is what I gravitate toward. So that's largely what I see poetry as, giving those images, the sensations, right, with all of the senses. And so in the poems I've written, it's from baby ages up through, there's a middle grade and a sort of young adult anthology that I'm part of. So I started submitting poems to magazines and anthologies around the same time that I was writing some picture books and my middle grade novel that you're referring to. And you're right that I think there is a commonality there, that even when writing longer form, I do like to think about things on that line level and make sure that each word has earned its place, which is really important in poetry. Yeah. A lot of the poetry I write is rhyming, and poetry doesn't have to rhyme, of course. But I tend to gravitate toward rhyme, especially with younger readers, because it has been shown that it's part of early literacy. It helps kids start to identify words, start to anticipate what they're going to hear next. And I just find it really fun. And the restraints of end rhyme and of meter, I think, also just can help tighten things. Yeah. But you want to be careful, I think, in writing in rhyme, that you're not just putting things in to make the rhyme scheme work rather than it's still doing that same work of needing to be there in the piece.
Right. And I love your word restraint, because I feel like sometimes, oh, poetry is too restraining, and that people, they get intimidated by the rules or whatever. But there's so many different types of poetry, and sometimes, like you're saying, a little restraint, especially for wordy people like me, is a good thing. It gets you that picture that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's almost like having that containment can free you up more rather than just being able to go in any direction. That can sometimes feel just overwhelming.
Right. Yeah. No, I love that. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about maybe how poetry started to get published here. Maybe how you went about looking to publish your poetry. Was there because it can be, again, speaking of overwhelming, very overwhelming, all the different avenues, and some that aren't legitimate, some that are. So maybe walk people who, hey, they have some poetry they'd love to share publicly, but they're almost overwhelmed by what is available and how to do it. So maybe give us some insight into that process of your magazines and things like that.
Sure. So the poetry I write and have published has all been children's poetry. So I don't have a lot to say in terms of the world of publishing adult poetry. In terms of kids poetry, the main areas are going to be magazines like Cricket and Highlights and High Five. And then Australia has something called the School Magazine, and a lot of my
randomly
poems,
Australia.
Australia, well, it's sponsored by the government, and
Oh.
so they get these magazines into their schools.
Wow.
And they're fantastic. I mean, the artwork is gorgeous in those. So I think I've had over 50 kids' poems published, and a lot of those have been in the school magazine. They have, I think, 5 different branches of their magazine for different age groups. And they're similar to Cricket in that way. And Highlights has also now Highlights has High Five and Highlights Hello, and then the regular Highlights.
Okay.
So different age groups that you can write from. And a lot of those, you go online and you go to their submittable page, which is an online system that you use to send your work. You see if they have a call open. Oftentimes they're closed to submissions.
Oh, okay.
But the Cricket Media Group often will be open to submissions not for a specific call, but then every now and then they're looking for poems about mythology or something very specific as well. Right. And then for the school magazine, they're usually always open. And then I haven't seen them have specific calls of things that they're looking for, but I'm sure that different times of year they are looking for things. And then anthologies, I've largely heard about those through an online critique group that I'm part of for poets. It's an international group. And in addition to critiquing each other's work, we share calls that we hear about for, this editor is going to have an anthology coming out. There are some really well-known people in the children's poetry world, like Sylvia Vardell and Janet Wong. I've been in a couple of their anthologies. So it's really just about hearing when those calls are coming out.
Right. And what's that critique group? Is it like a huge international thing that is broken into regions, or how does that work?
It's not broken into regions. It's an international group that is based on applications. You apply to get into the group, you submit some of your work, and then periodically, it's not very often, periodically the group opens to new members if some people are transitioning out, or sometimes people they have books coming out and they aren't able to be as active anymore.
Right.
There is an expectation that you submit your work regularly and that you critique regularly, so that really keeps it going and keeps it active.
Yeah, and it's just poetry, right?
Just poetry. So sometimes people will share rhyming picture books or rhyming board books as well, but it not longer works than that.
And what's that called?
That's called Poet's Garage.
Poet's Garage. Okay.
Yeah.
So any tips in terms of like someone goes on to Highlights or whatever that you found in terms of, okay, these poems I probably won't even bother submitting versus this poem may have a better chance of actually getting published, or anything like that that you've discovered along your journey?
So there are a few specific things I've learned about the different magazines. I think that Highlights tends to like things that are universal. They tend to like things that may be a little bit more commercial in terms of the tone. They have certain things they won't publish, like they won't do anything with pirates.
Anything with pirates?
Yeah, that's part of, they'll have certain.
It's very niche.
Well, but I think, they're concerned about real life piracy and other reasons, right, that they have. So you kind of start to learn those specific things about magazines. I think the things I've published in the cricket magazines, they tend to like some of my more nature-oriented poetry, which is something that I do gravitate toward quite a bit. And I think it's largely about writing for the right age group. It's very hard so Baby Bug and Hello, this is for the 0 to 3 audience. And it's hard to write for this age group if you really like to, really savor the language, because it's simple. So you want to have things that are engaging, often involve some body movement, some activity, which is different than if you're writing for a school-age kid or even a middle school kid.
Right. And when you said commercial, you want to kind of describe to the audience what that means in terms of content?
Sure. So often we think about something that is just really, it has a hook that really kind of grabs you right away, highly illustratable too in this context, which you want to think about in terms of magazine poetry in general. But often with some magazines, they'll have more spreads. In the work I've had in High Five, it's been one spread, so just 2 pages, so they want to be able to capture it maybe in that one image. That will vary. Other people will have stories and highlights or High Five that will spread across multiple pages. But that's been my experience with them.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And any other things that, in terms of stepping stones to getting to your, what we're going to kind of focus on in a second, your picture book, which is like a poem encapsulated in a beautiful package. Anything that, did you go right from magazines to that, or was there anything else that sort of helped gear you up towards your final product?
So I guess I was writing those simultaneously. I was starting to get into picture books as I was also starting to submit poetry. I didn't submit things for a really long time. I've written poetry for most of my life, and I've written songs, and I've been asked to do poems for friends' weddings and things like that, but I wasn't really pursuing getting published. So I started doing that around the same time, and I think that it's a similar process in terms of writing a picture book and writing a poem for me, except for the fact that I can write poems in these really short periods of time. I often, if I'm stuck on something else, I'll say, I'm just going to go write a poem or just kind of get some thoughts out. I don't have to think about the arc as much. I don't have to think about, I don't even worry about if it ever gets picked up. I can just kind of write it. I think sometimes with books, we can get in our way a little bit more, kind of thinking about the audience or thinking about if it's going to work or not. And I think just getting poems on the page is a way to help the other work then start to flow.
Yeah, and I love that as sometimes we talk about writer's block or whatever, exercising your literary brain. I think that's a really great tip for people, even people that don't think they like poetry or write poetry, quote unquote. That could be a nice little just, give yourself a break from the project and do a little, just do something 4 lines or whatever. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly. And you might end up pulling on that in something you're working on. You might not, but you're just getting those juices flowing.
Yeah. So patterns everywhere. Let's sort of shine a spotlight on that in terms of using that as our, speaking of the arc. So where did the idea or the spark of inspiration come from for that book, and how did that kind of evolve into your first book?
Yeah. So Patterns Everywhere started on a family hike. So my husband is an earth and planetary scientist, and we were out together as a family. He was pointing out some things in the landscapes to my kids, and I said, patterns everywhere. And that
of course, the poet said that.
I said, patterns everywhere. And my kids love rhyme. My kids love poetry. With one of my children, actually, we had a tradition that for a very long time where I had to make up a poem every night before bed. And I mean, some of them would be terrible. And she said, the meter was off on that one, Mom. But they awesome. Love playing with words.
Yeah.
And so as we were out on the hike, I was just, that line was in my head, patterns everywhere, which became a repeated line in the text. And I sat down when I got home, and I think I jotted out a stanza. And then I said, I should look to see what else is out there. I'm sure there are books about patterns in nature. And so then my next step was to go and see what's out there. And I'm always careful about this because I want to have a sense of if this exact thing has been done before, but I also don't want to be influenced by what's out there too much.
Right.
So I found some titles that I said, oh, they're about very specific patterns in nature. There's one about spirals or the Fibonacci sequence. And I said, I want to do something that is about a wide range of patterns, not just one, but I also want to have it have a container of some sort so it just doesn't go on and on. I mean, am I going to do tiger stripes? Am I going, where am I going to stop?
Yeah. It's like that poetry you're talking about. You need some rails there.
Yeah, you need something to give it that shape, to have that form. So I decided to focus largely on geologic patterns. I ended up having I have a spiral of a snail in there, and I have coral, which the coral wasn't in there initially. That was something the editor asked me to add later because we had a couple of extra spreads to play with, so I added a few. But it was having that shape then that allowed me to really dive in and start researching. And so, but this is a nonfiction picture book, so the first step then was to start learning about these different patterns. I asked my husband what some interesting ones were that he thought I should address, and they matched up with some of what I had written down as well. And then I talked to some other experts in their fields and gathered some more information because it's written in rhyme, the main text, but then there are sidebars, and maybe I can show here. And that was another decision, was how to structure the book. And as I said, I love writing in rhyme, but I also wanted to have older readers or readers who are just more curious and want to learn more be able to dive deeper into some of the subjects.
And that's a good point, that, sometimes people think picture book means toddler or really young elementary, and some like this is bridging that gap. You can choose to have a simplified version for younger, and then if you want to, like you're saying, dive deeper, I think that's a great point to make.
Exactly, that you can have young readers. And I've done this book at preschool story times where I'll show a picture and say, what do you think this is? There's a leaf vein, and they'll say, oh, that's a leaf. Or I'll say, for a little bit older kids, why are there different colors? What do you think? And we don't necessarily even need to read all of the text. But when I designed it so that there is a rhyming stanza, and then this we call either a text box or a sidebar that goes into more detail. And so when I read it with kids, usually I won't read the entire page on every single page. I'll read the main text. And then on some of them, if they want to learn more, I'll go into the sidebars. And when kids read it on their own, they can do the same thing. Or there might be some who say, I only want to read the main text. Or, you know what, I've read that before, I just want to find out more details. So that was a really fun part.
I love that that's sort of a really great entry-level nonfiction text for kids too, right? Like, they don't have to feel intimidated that there's only that higher level option, because I mean, kids in the same grade read at all different levels. So I love that there's sort of options there.
Yeah,
that's great.
Thank you.
Yay.
That's patterns everywhere.
So did you do the poetry, or the photography, or?
I did not do the photography for that. This was one that I actually submitted the book as if it were going to be illustrated.
Oh.
And I can tell you a little bit about that submission process.
That's interesting.
Because at the time that I wrote this, I was not yet agented, and I hadn't really started querying much. I maybe sent out a couple of queries. But I wanted to have my middle grade novel done before I really queried in earnest. So I had gone to a conference. It was a virtual conference, actually, Agent Editor Day through North NESCBWI.
Yeah.
And one of the editors there was someone that a couple of authors who I had done critiques with had said, oh, I think that manuscript would be good for that editor. So then when I met her in this conference, I was able to submit to her.
Oh, wonderful.
And they were right. She liked the manuscript, but she said, how would you feel about having it be photo illustrated instead of doing it with an illustrator drawing the pictures? And I said, wow, given the subject matter and how fascinating it is to see these in nature, I think that would be a great idea. So I had actually submitted with the original manuscript some reference images. They weren't, none of those exact images are in the book, but some of them are pretty close. Because I wanted the editor to have a picture of what these looked like. What do the painted hills of Oregon look like? What do mud cracks look like? What are basalt columns? Because they're so fascinating. And I thought those would also be helpful for the illustrator. But instead, the book designer was able to use those as ideas to then get the images for the book.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that it makes total sense, especially where it's a nonfiction text to have nonfiction photos. I love it. So any particular one in there that you struggled with the most, or that came the easiest, or anything to do with writing that you learned along the process?
Well, I'd say probably the one that I found the most exciting to write is one that not a lot of people know about, which is the even spacing of ridges and valleys, which is something that actually my husband studies. And you can see this is Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. And I always have people say, wait, what? Tell me more about that. I mean, kids are just fascinated about the ways that, because rivers are etching these valleys, they tend to space themselves evenly over time. And there's a explanation of that here. And it's just gorgeous, right, to look at. So I feel like I learned a lot more about that in detail when I was gathering more information and having my husband really explain it to me. I knew it was something he researched, but I didn't quite get it. So I learned a lot on that one. And I also learned a lot with corals, because I hadn't included that in the original. And the editor said, oh, we have coral on the cover. So do you want to make a spread about that? And I said, oh, okay, sure. So in this one, the sidebar shares a little bit more about how they get these beautiful colors, which come from algae, right, which are, they take sunlight and help make food for themselves and for the corals.
Okay.
And I just think these pictures, I say, coral creatures dot the seas, shaped like mushrooms, brains, and trees. And they found the images that really captured that.
Awesome.
So that was a really fun one to write.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is amazing. Like you said, once you're looking, all these different patterns everywhere. And now when I go for a walk, I'm going to say patterns everywhere.
Yeah.
Because it really is fascinating that that's just created by nature.
Exactly. It is, yeah.
So you find your editor. Your editor decides, okay, photography. So did they run the photos by you first, or was it all a surprise to you when it came out?
No, I definitely got to look at the photos. And I think that's something that's written into the contract, right, that I get to have that review process, and which was great. Most of the photos were spot on. There were a couple that I said, oh, I'm not sure this completely captures the text or completely captures the phenomenon, maybe something a little bit more like this, on just a couple. And then they found things that were spot on for that.
Oh, great. Yeah. And so what was the timeline? So between, okay, you've written this before you've revised it with your critique group and everything, but the spark of inspiration to when you actually held the book in your hand?
So start to finish, it was about 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and a lot of that was waiting. So, I drafted it, there was the research process, sharing it with critique partners, as you said, and then once I got the offer, it was right around that time actually that I also got my agent, so she was able to negotiate the deal.
Oh, great.
But then from the time of the offer to publication was just under 2 years. And some of that is just their lists are full. So they said, we're going to be booking it for 2023, even though that was 2021. And there's the process of going through the text for editing, them securing the images, the photo permissions, and then getting it printed, and the whole editing process just takes a little while.
And so for a nonfiction, so you have your editor that I assume does everything, fiction, nonfiction. Is she the one sort of checking the facts for nonfiction, or did they have another fact-checking kind of, or did they just rely on you to have your facts correct?
So I submitted all of my sources with this. Sometimes, depending on the manuscript, they will. I think because of the sources that I had, they questioned some more of is this the clearest way to put this, but not so much the facts themselves. I have 2 nonfiction board books coming out with Simon & Schuster this year, and then one's next year. Those, we've gone through some pretty intensive fact-checking. I also had a lot of sources for those, but it was for such a young audience. They really wanted to be careful about what do we include, what do we leave out. If you leave out something because you want to make it clear to a younger audience, does it end up becoming misleading because you're only sharing a part of it? So that one was a little trickier on that front. So I think it's different book to book.
Right,
You know?
and I think that's something no one would even necessarily think of, the different publishers having just different approaches to it. So nonfiction, you have a fiction here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just hearing how the nonfiction goes, that it has this another layer of fact checking. Preference for fiction versus nonfiction, whether it's the writing, the editorial, or even just watching that whole process unfold, is there in your mind?
You know, I like them both, and I like them both in different ways. In some ways, writing fiction is a little bit easier because you don't have to go through that process of fact checking, right? It's anything that you want to write about. However, there is something about the facts and having that specific topic that you're writing about that also gives it that focus, that gives you that direction, that can help shape the text. And so I think fiction can feel overwhelming sometimes that way, in kind of how, where do you take it, right? Especially when we talk about longer works. And
Right.
I think I've said this to you before with middle grade, you know, I get to decide if this person lives or dies.
Right.
You know, I have these big choices to make. And so with nonfiction, you don't have as many choices. Now there's still the choice of what do you leave in, what do you not, what do you take out, what do you leave in, what's your focus, and all of that comes into play. So that, I guess I lean toward nonfiction in that way, but I really do enjoy working on both of them. And I have a mix of nonfiction and fiction coming out over the next couple of years. And each book is different in the editing process. You know, I thought, the nonfiction are so tough the editing is a lot longer and harder. I have one that's coming out in 2025. Now, knock on wood, I'm not sure I might get more edits, but so far they sent me the sketches with 0 edits. And I went, ooh, that was nice. So again, that might shift, but it can just depend on the manuscript, depend on the publisher, and it can all be different.
Right. And so for your other nonfiction books, are they all jumping off from poetry, or are they different mediums of text?
They are all jumping off from poetry.
Okay.
And this is, I mean, I think I've sold 7 books to editors, and they are all rhyming. And a lot of people will say that it's hard to sell rhyming books. And a lot of poets will tell you that they've had the opposite experience, that there is a high demand. And, you know, people want to make sure that you have you understand meter if you're writing in rhyme, that you're not using a lot of, you know, maybe overused sort of tired rhymes. But there's definitely a demand for it. And I think particularly with nonfiction, it increases rereadability when kids, it's been shown that kids do come back and back to text that rhymes. And so when you have that, and then you have additional information that they may choose to engage with, I think that, again, increases your audience and hopefully makes it more of a lasting book.
Yeah. Well, and I almost feel sometimes when you need to memorize facts at school and things like that, they have you sing a song or make a rhyme. So I can just imagine it's really complementary to the learning process, which is what you're doing when you're given nonfiction. So, all right. So what's it like to publish your first book? You finally get there. You've got the book. What do you do now?
Yeah, well, it's exciting. The first thing I did with Patterns Everywhere was I said I want to do a launch party. I want to do an event. And so I did that event at White Loom Books in Reading, and they were very welcoming, and did a read aloud. And I've since been doing some school visits and I did story time at the library in Melrose, and I have some preschool visits coming up with my board book, My Love for You. And so it's really fun to share the work with kids and to see the questions that they have. And sometimes the questions seem completely unrelated.
Yeah.
But I was reading this book, and a kid raised their hand and asked me a question about dinosaurs. And I thought, what does that have to do with patterns? But then I realized as he was talking more that it had to do with kind of thinking about the earth, and was that here on the earth at the time of the dinosaurs. And so you never know where a reader is going to go with something that you wrote, right? They can take it in a completely different direction.
Right.
And I think it's really fun to see how the mind makes those different connections.
Yeah. That's awesome. And you want to talk just very briefly about, getting the journey of this just in a sound bite almost, in terms of the difference that you felt between the nonfiction and the fiction coming to publication process?
Sure. Yeah, my love for you was also inspired by a family activity. Actually, it was a day at Crane Beach, and that one I think draws more on my work as a psychotherapist because it's an I love you book. It's a kind of perennial theme that people will write about, but to me it's also about things that end and love continuing on, and which is about secure attachment in childhood and how that stays with us throughout the life course. That sense of being cared for no matter what, even when everything around us is changing. So the process with that book was I submitted it as a picture book, actually. My agent submitted it as a picture book, and it was acquired as a board book. So I had to trim it a little bit. I had to cut and readjust some spreads. But from there, once we did the trimming, it was pretty much set.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
So can't wait to see what are the books that are you allowed to mention your next books at all? Or?
I am. Most of them have been announced. So the next two that are coming out are a nonfiction board book series with Simon & Schuster that tell me about space and tell me about oceans. Okay. And those are for the youngest readers who are curious about those things. And then next spring, I actually have a picture book coming out with my husband, who I said is an earth and planetary scientist. That's about rocks.
That's awesome.
And yeah,
all the family.
Yeah. And then I have a couple more the following year that I think haven't been announced yet.
Okay. Well, we'll have to stay tuned for those. Well, congratulations. Thanks for coming in and telling us all about this. Any last parting advice for the writers in the audience that are at any point in this process that you'd like to give them?
To offer? Sure. I think the best advice I got was to just put yourself out there. Just go to the conferences if you can. If you can't go in person, if you can do some virtual meetings or critiques with other authors. The Kidlit community is so supportive. As I said, I've had authors say, oh, I think you should submit to this editor. I've had authors say, oh, use me as a reference for this editor or this agent. And you never expect that and never ask for it.
Right.
But just you'll see how encouraging people can be. And it's just, you won't ever see that if you don't take that leap and just put your work out there and go for it. And there's contests as well. There's some online contests that people will do. And it's another way to just have your work seen, see what's working, what's not working, and be part of that community.
Right. Community. I love it. All right. Well, thank you, Lisa. And if anybody would like to come in and sit where Lisa's sitting and tell us about your publication process and your writing process, check out theroomtowrite.org and email me at Colleen@theroomtowrite.org.